My husband told his entire family my broken body couldn't have kids when it was actually his infertility. So I read his medical records out loud at family dinner. My husband Rick and I had been trying for a baby for 2 years when we decided to see a fertility specialist. The test showed we both had issues that made conception difficult, but not impossible. I had mild endometriosis and Rick had low sperm motility and count. The doctor said with treatment we had a good chance, but it would take time and both of us would need medication. Rick seemed supportive in the office, held my hand, said we were in this together. But the moment we got to the car, he said we couldn't tell anyone about his results, especially not his mother. He said it would destroy her if she knew her son wasn't perfect. I agreed because I thought we were protecting his privacy as a couple. What I didn't know was that Rick immediately called his mother Diane and told her we'd gotten results and it was all my fault. He said my body was broken and couldn't carry children, but he was standing by me because that's what good husbands do. Diane started treating me like I was defective. At every family dinner, she'd pat my hand and say it was so noble of Rick to stay with a woman who couldn't give him children. She'd tell everyone at the table about her friend's son who left his infertile wife and now had 3 beautiful kids. She'd look at Rick and say he was too loyal for his own good. She started bringing articles about adoption, surrogacy, and even divorce lawyers who specialized in childless marriages. She'd leave them on my plate at dinner like place settings. Rick would just shrug and say his mom meant well. She'd make comments about my diet, saying maybe if I ate better, my body would work properly. She'd critique my exercise routine, my sleep schedule, my stress levels. Everything was my fault. When I took fertility medication that made me gain weight, she said I was letting myself go because I couldn't have children anyway. Rick never corrected her. He'd actually add details about my treatment to make it sound worse, saying I had to take dozens of pills, that the doctors were surprised it was so severe, that they'd never seen such a difficult case. None of that was true, but it made him look like a hero for staying with me. Diane started this thing where she'd bring other women to family dinners. Young, healthy-looking women she'd met at her gym or church who she'd introduce as friends, but then mention they wanted children someday. She'd seat them next to Rick and spend the whole dinner talking about their good genes and healthy bodies. Rick would entertain it, laughing at their jokes, exchanging numbers for networking purposes, he said. One woman actually texted him asking if he was really happy in his marriage, and he didn't shut it down immediately, said he needed time to think about his future. I saw the messages when they popped up on his iPad. The worst part was Diane started a prayer circle at her church for my broken body. She had dozens of people praying for my defective womb every Sunday. She'd send me videos of the prayers where they'd mention me by name, asking God to fix whatever was wrong with me so I wouldn't deprive Rick of fatherhood. She made prayer cards with my photo that said, "Pray for Leslie's fertility," and handed them out at church events. People I'd never met would come up to me at the grocery store saying they were praying for my condition. Meanwhile, Rick was supposed to be taking medication to improve his sperm quality, but he wasn't taking it. I found the unopened boxes hidden in his car. When I confronted him, he said there was no point since I was the main problem. He said the doctor just said he had issues to make me feel better, but everyone knew it was really all my fault. He was letting me take hormones that made me sick while he did nothing, because he decided the problem was mine alone. After a year of this, Diane organized what she called a healing ceremony for my broken womb. She invited the entire extended family to lay hands on my stomach and pray. Rick thought it was a beautiful gesture. I refused to attend. Diane cried and said I didn't want to be healed because I was punishing Rick. That's when I'd had enough. I went to our filing cabinet and pulled out all our medical records from the fertility specialist. Every test result, every lab report, everything showing Rick's issues were actually more severe than mine. The doctor had even written that male factor infertility was the primary issue. I made copies of everything. At the next family dinner, Diane started her usual speech about my defective body and how Rick deserved better. I pulled out the medical records and started reading them out loud. I read the first page out loud. The numbers were right there in black and white. Rick's sperm count was 5 million per milliliter when normal is 15 million or higher. His motility was only 20% when it should be at least 40%. The doctor had written in the notes that these results indicated severe male factor infertility that would require immediate treatment. I looked up from the paper and every single person at that table was staring at me like I'd just pulled a gun. Their faces went from confused to shocked as they processed what I was saying. Then everyone turned to look at Rick. His face went from normal to bright red in about 2 seconds. I could see the panic in his eyes as he realized what was happening. He pushed his chair back so hard it fell over and lunged across the table trying to grab the papers out of my hands. His brother Aaron grabbed his arm before he could reach me. Rick was pulling against Aaron's grip trying to get to the medical records while Aaron held him back. Diane's voice cut through the chaos saying those papers had to be fake. She kept repeating that I must have made them up somehow, that there was no way those were real test results. Her voice got louder and more insistent as she tried to convince everyone at the table that I was lying. I stayed calm and pulled out the second page from the folder. This one had more of the doctor's notes written in that messy handwriting doctors always have. I read it out loud too. The doctor wrote that male factor infertility was the primary concern in our case, and that Rick's issues would need to be addressed first before my mild endometriosis would even matter. Rick's father, Floyd, reached across the table and took the papers right out of my hands. I let him have them. He adjusted his reading glasses and started going through every page slowly. His face got darker and angrier with each line he read. I could see his jaw clenching as he realized his son had been lying to the whole family for over a year. Floyd looked at Rick with this expression I'd never seen before, like he was looking at a stranger instead of his own kid. Diane's voice got even louder, demanding to know where I got private medical records. She said I was breaking the law by sharing Rick's personal health information with everyone. She kept saying I was violating his privacy and his rights. I looked right at her and reminded her that she'd been sharing my supposed medical problems with her entire church for a year. I told her she made prayer cards with my face on them and handed them out to strangers. I said if privacy was so important, maybe she should have thought about that before she told dozens of people at her church that my womb was broken. I asked her if privacy was only a family value when it protected Rick and not when it protected me. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Rick's sister, Viviana, had tears running down her face. She looked at Rick and asked if everything he told them about my broken body was a lie. Her voice cracked when she said it. The waiter picked that exact moment to walk up to our table. He had this cheerful expression ready to ask if we needed anything. He took one look at Viviana crying, Rick being held back by Aaron, Diane's shocked face, and Floyd reading medical records with a dark expression. The waiter's smile disappeared and he backed away from our table without saying a word. He practically ran back to the kitchen. I would have laughed if the situation wasn't so awful. Floyd put the papers down on the table and told Diane to be quiet for once. His voice was hard and cold. Then he looked directly at Rick and asked him straight out if he lied about the fertility results. Rick was still breathing hard from trying to grab the papers from me. He stammered something about how the doctors were just trying to make me feel better. He said his issues weren't the real problem, and the doctors only said he had problems so I wouldn't feel so bad about my broken body. Floyd's expression got even darker. He told Rick to stop lying and answer the question with the truth. I pulled out my own test results from the folder. These showed my endometriosis diagnosis and the treatment plan. I passed them to Aaron since he was sitting closest to me. Aaron read through them carefully. He looked confused and said these results looked pretty normal. He said this wasn't anything like what Rick had told them was wrong with me. Aaron kept reading and pointed out that my doctor had written the endometriosis was mild and very treatable with standard medication. He asked Rick why he told everyone I had such severe problems when the medical records showed something completely different. Diane tried a different approach. Her voice got softer and she said Rick was probably just trying to protect me from embarrassment. She said he must have taken the blame privately with her because he loved me and didn't want me to feel bad. She made it sound like Rick was being noble by lying about me to his entire family. I laughed and it came out bitter and harsh. I asked her how telling everyone I was defective protected me from anything. I said Rick let her organize prayer circles about my broken womb and bring other women to family dinners to replace me. I asked how any of that was protecting me from embarrassment. Rick finally exploded. He yelled that I had no right to do this to him. He said I was trying to humiliate him in front of his family and destroy his reputation. His voice got louder with each word until he was practically screaming. Floyd cut him off mid-sentence. He said Rick humiliated himself by lying for over a year. He said Rick let his mother torture his wife based on lies, and that was something Rick chose to do. Floyd's voice was steady, but there was so much anger underneath it. He told Rick that no one did this to him except himself. Viviana was still crying. She asked Rick why he would do something so cruel. She said she didn't understand how he could let everyone believe such terrible things about me when he knew the truth. Rick's voice got quiet. He muttered something about how his mother couldn't handle knowing her son wasn't perfect. He said he panicked when he got the results and told his mom it was my fault because he knew she would be disappointed in him if she knew the truth. Diane's face went pale. She looked like someone had slapped her. I watched her realize that her own behavior had pushed her son to lie and abuse his wife for over a year just to avoid her disappointment. I pushed my chair back from the table and stood up. My hands were shaking, but my voice came out steady when I told them I was leaving because I'd said everything I needed to say. Rick lunged around the table and grabbed my wrist hard enough that I felt his fingernails dig into my skin. His face was red and sweaty, and he kept saying we could fix this. We just needed to talk privately. His family didn't understand the full situation. His grip got tighter as he tried to pull me back toward my chair. Aaron stood up fast and grabbed Rick's arm, telling him to let go of me right now. Rick jerked away from Aaron but kept holding my wrist until Aaron physically pried his fingers off one by one. I pulled my arm back and rubbed the red marks Rick's fingers left on my skin. Diane started crying louder and saying this was all a misunderstanding that could be worked out if everyone just calmed down. I picked up my purse and the folder of medical records and walked toward the front door. Rick followed me calling my name, but Aaron blocked his path and told him to give me space. Floyd stood up from the table and followed me outside. The cool night air hit my face and I realized how hot and stuffy the dining room had been. My heart was pounding, so hard I could feel it in my throat. Floyd walked with me across the driveway to where I'd parked on the street. He moved slowly like he was trying not to scare me off. When we reached my car, he stopped and put his hands in his pockets. He looked older than he had at the start of dinner, tired and sad in a way I'd never seen before. He said he owed me an apology for not questioning Rick's story sooner. He said he knew Diane could be harsh sometimes, but he didn't realize how bad things had gotten. He'd thought she was just being her usual pushy self about grandchildren, not that she was actively cruel based on lies Rick told her. Floyd said he should have asked me directly about the fertility issues instead of just accepting what Rick said. He told me I deserved, so much better than what his family had put me through this past year. His voice cracked a little when he said he was ashamed of how his son had treated me and how he'd let it happen under his own roof. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and unlocked my car. Floyd stepped back to give me room to open the door. He said if I needed anything or wanted to talk, I could call him directly anytime. Then he walked back toward the house with his shoulders hunched forward like he was carrying something heavy. I got in my car and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking, so bad it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. I could see Rick standing in the front doorway watching me, but Aaron was still blocking him from coming outside. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb faster than I should have. The adrenaline was making everything feel sharp and bright and too real. Part of me felt amazing, like I'd finally stood up for myself after a year of taking abuse. But another part was absolutely scared about what would happen next. I'd just blown up my husband's entire family in front of everyone. There was no taking that back or pretending it didn't happen. My phone started buzzing in my purse before I even made it to the end of the street. I pulled it out at a red light and saw text messages popping up from different numbers. Viviana sent 3 messages asking if I was okay. Aaron sent one saying he was sorry for not seeing what Rick was doing. Even Floyd sent a message saying to drive safe. I put the phone on silent and shoved it back in my purse. I needed to focus on getting home without crashing because my hands were still shaking on the steering wheel. The drive home felt longer than usual even though it was only 15 minutes. Every stoplight seemed to last forever, and I kept checking my rearview mirror to make sure Rick wasn't following me. When I finally pulled into our driveway, I sat in the car for a minute trying to catch my breath. The house looked normal from the outside, exactly like it had when I left for dinner. But everything felt different now. I grabbed my purse and the folder of medical records and went inside. I locked the front door behind me, and then went around checking that all the other doors and windows were locked too. I knew Rick had his key, but somehow making sure everything was locked made me feel a little safer. I didn't turn on any lights, just stood in the dark living room trying to process what I'd just done. The furniture looked strange in the shadows, like I was seeing it for the first time. This was the couch where Rick and I used to watch movies on weekends. That was the coffee table where Diane left those divorce lawyer articles for me to find. The whole house felt contaminated now by all the lies Rick had told here. I'd been living in this space thinking we were partners working through fertility issues together. But really, I'd been living with someone who was actively destroying my reputation to protect his own ego. The silence in the house was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. I sat down on the couch in the dark and just stared at the wall. My phone started ringing and I jumped even though it was on silent and just vibrating in my purse. I pulled it out and saw Libby's name on the screen. I answered and her voice came through asking if I was okay, saying Viviana had texted her asking about me. That's when I started crying for real. Not the angry tears from dinner, but the kind that come from deep in your chest. I told Libby everything that happened. How I read Rick's medical records out loud. How Diane tried to defend him. How Rick grabbed me and Aaron had to pull him off. Libby kept saying she was proud of me and that I did the right thing. She asked if I wanted her to come over and stay with me, but I told her I needed tonight alone to think. I needed to sit in this house by myself and figure out what came next. Libby made me promise to call her if I changed my mind, or if Rick showed up and made me uncomfortable. After we hung up, I sat in the dark some more. My phone kept buzzing with more texts, but I didn't look at them. I went upstairs and got ready for bed even though it was still early. I locked the bedroom door from the inside and got under the covers with all my clothes still on. Around midnight, I heard Rick's car pull into the driveway. I stayed completely still in bed listening to him come in through the front door. He walked through the downstairs and I could track his movement by the sound of his footsteps. Then he came upstairs and tried the bedroom door. When he found it locked, he knocked quietly and said my name. He used his calm, reasonable voice, the one he used when he wanted to make me feel like I was overreacting. He said we needed to talk about this like adults and work through what happened. I didn't answer. He knocked again and said he knew I was in there, and ignoring him wasn't going to solve anything. I stayed quiet. After a few more minutes, he said fine. He'd give me space tonight, but we were going to deal with this in the morning. I heard him walk down the hall to the guest room. The door closed, and then the house got quiet again. I lay there in the dark, wondering how I'd ended up married to someone who could lie so completely and then act like I was the problem for exposing it. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a second, I was confused, thinking maybe last night had been a bad dream. But then I remembered everything and my stomach dropped. I got out of bed and went downstairs. Rick was in the kitchen making breakfast like it was a normal Sunday morning. He'd made my favorite coffee the way I liked it and was cooking bacon and eggs. He smiled when he saw me and said good morning like nothing had happened. He put a plate of food in front of me and sat down across the table. He started talking about how his family had overreacted last night, and once everyone calmed down, we could all move past this together. He said Diane called him late last night, very upset, and he'd talked her down. He acted like the problem was everyone's reaction to the truth, not the truth itself. I stared at the breakfast he made and felt sick. This was exactly what he always did, pretending everything was fine and I was being difficult if I stayed upset. I told him I wasn't moving past anything until he explained why he lied to his entire family and let his mother abuse me for a year. Rick's face changed and he got that expression he used when he was annoyed with me. He said he didn't let Diane do anything, that she just got carried away with trying to help us have a baby. He said I was making it sound worse than it was by using words like abuse. He reminded me that his mother meant well even if her methods were pushy. I asked him about the prayer circles where strangers prayed for my broken body based on lies he told. I asked about the women Diane brought to family dinners to replace me. Rick waved his hand like I was bringing up minor details that didn't matter. He said those were just his mother being his mother, and I knew what she was like when I married him. Rick leaned forward and his voice got softer. He admitted that yes, he told Diane it was my fault when we first got the test results. He said he panicked because he didn't want her to be disappointed in him. His whole life, Diane had expected him to be perfect, and he couldn't handle telling her he had fertility problems. He said he planned to tell her the truth eventually, but it never seemed like the right time. The longer he waited, the harder it got to admit he'd lied. He made it sound like a small mistake that just got out of hand, not a deliberate choice he made over and over for a year. I asked why eventually never came even when I was taking medication that made me sick and gaining weight while his mother called me defective. Rick looked down at his plate and said he knew he should have spoken up sooner, but he didn't know how to fix it once it had gone on so long. I brought up the medication boxes I found hidden in his car, the ones he was supposed to be taking to improve his sperm quality. Rick's jaw tightened and he said the side effects were too uncomfortable. He'd tried taking them for a few weeks and they made him feel sick and tired all the time. He said besides, my issues needed to be addressed first anyway before his treatment would even matter. The doctor had said we both needed medication, but Rick decided on his own that only mine was important. He'd let me pump my body full of hormones while he hid his pills in the car and told everyone the problem was all mine. I looked at him sitting across from me eating the breakfast he made and realized I was looking at a stranger. This wasn't the man I thought I married. That man had never existed. I pushed my plate away and told him I wanted marriage counseling, but only if he called his mother right now and told her the complete truth about everything. Rick's face shifted and he said we should probably work through our issues privately first before involving his family more. I repeated that he needed to call Diane immediately, or there was no point in counseling because our whole marriage was built on lies he told to protect himself. He picked up his phone and put it back down 3 times, each time coming up with a new reason why this wasn't the right moment to call. His mother would be at church, or she'd be too upset to hear it over the phone, or we should wait until family dinner next week to tell everyone together. I watched him make excuses and understood that he would never voluntarily tell the truth, because his image mattered more than anything else. I stood up and told him I needed space to think, that I was going to stay with Libby for a few days. Rick's expression changed completely, and he said I was abandoning our marriage when things got difficult, that a good wife would stay and work through problems instead of running away. I reminded him that a good husband wouldn't have lied to everyone for a year and let his mother abuse his wife, but he talked over me saying I was being dramatic and making everything worse by leaving. He followed me to the bedroom where I pulled out a small suitcase and started packing clothes. Rick stood in the doorway listing all the ways I was failing as a wife by not giving him a chance to fix things, as if he hadn't had hundreds of chances over the past year. I opened the closet to grab some shoes, and found a stack of papers on Rick's side that I'd never seen before. I pulled them out and saw they were printed articles about adoption agencies, surrogacy costs, and international adoption requirements. Every single article had notes in Rick's handwriting in the margins, talking about how these would be our only options because of my fertility problems. One article about surrogacy had a note that said, "Leslie's eggs probably won't work, need to find egg donor." Another about adoption had, "Tell agency about Leslie's medical issues," circled 3 times. He'd been researching all of this and planning our future around lies he knew weren't true, writing down my supposed problems like they were facts he needed to work around. I held up the papers and asked him what these were. Rick glanced at them and said he was just exploring options for us to have kids since my treatment wasn't working. I pointed to his notes about my eggs not working and asked how he could write that when he knew his sperm issues were worse than anything wrong with me. He said he was just being realistic about our situation, and I was getting upset over nothing. I shoved the articles into my suitcase along with my clothes because I wanted evidence of how calculated his lies had been. Rick tried to grab the papers from me saying those were his private research, and I laughed at him using the word private after what he'd done. I texted Libby that I needed her to pick me up, and she responded immediately asking if I was okay. Rick saw me texting and demanded to know if I was telling my friends lies about him, if I was trying to turn everyone against him like I did with his family. I ignored him and finished packing, throwing in toiletries and my laptop without caring if things matched or made sense. Libby texted that she'd be there in 20 minutes, and I went to wait by the front door with my suitcase. Rick followed me through the house saying I was making a huge mistake, that walking out wouldn't solve anything, that I was destroying our marriage over something we could fix if I just calmed down. I sat on the floor by the door with my suitcase next to me and checked my phone to avoid looking at him. He kept talking at me, his voice getting louder and more desperate, but I didn't respond to anything he said. When Libby's car pulled up outside, I grabbed my suitcase and walked out without saying goodbye to Rick. He followed me onto the front porch still talking, saying I couldn't just leave like this, that we needed to discuss things like adults. Libby got out of her car and positioned herself between me and Rick, telling him I needed space and he needed to respect that. I put my suitcase in her back seat and got in the passenger seat, locking the door immediately. Rick stood on the porch watching us, and Libby drove away while he was still standing there. Once we turned the corner and I couldn't see the house anymore, I started crying. Libby reached over and squeezed my hand, but didn't say anything, just let me cry while she drove to her apartment. After a few minutes, I wiped my face and told her about the articles I found with Rick's notes about my supposed problems. Libby's hands tightened on the steering wheel, and she said Viviana had been texting her all morning asking how to help, saying she was horrified by what Rick did. I found it strange that Rick's own sister was more on my side than he was, that she believed me immediately while he was still making excuses. At Libby's apartment, she set me up in her spare bedroom and brought me tea while I unpacked my suitcase. I pulled out my phone and saw I had dozens of unread texts from the night before that I'd been too overwhelmed to look at. I started reading through them and found messages from Aaron saying he couldn't believe his brother had lied like that, and asking if I needed anything. Viviana had sent multiple texts saying she was so sorry for believing Rick's version, and that she should have asked me directly what was happening. Even Floyd had texted saying he owed me an apology for not questioning things sooner. I scrolled through all the messages and noticed that Diane and Rick were the only family members who hadn't acknowledged what actually happened. Everyone else was expressing shock and offering support, but the 2 people most responsible for the lies were silent. My phone rang and I saw it was Diane calling. I almost sent it to voicemail, but curiosity made me answer. She started talking immediately without waiting for me to say hello, telling me we needed to discuss privately how to handle this situation as a family. I cut her off and said I was done being handled by her family, that they'd been handling me for a year by lying about my body to everyone we knew. Diane's voice changed, and she said she wanted to apologize for being harsh with me, though she phrased it as not knowing the full story, rather than admitting she'd been cruel based on lies. I asked if she'd apologize to her prayer circle for making them pray over false information about my body, if she'd told all those people at church that she'd been wrong about me. There was a long silence, and then Diane said she was trying to help, and didn't know Rick was lying to her. Her voice got defensive, and she suggested that maybe the doctors had made mistakes with the test results, that sometimes labs mix up paperwork. I hung up on her while she was still talking because I was done explaining basic facts to people who didn't want to hear them. That evening, I was sitting on Libby's couch trying to decompress when someone started pounding on the apartment door. Libby looked through the peephole and turned back to me, mouthing that it was Rick. He started yelling through the door that he needed to talk to me, that this was ridiculous and I needed to come out and discuss things. Libby opened the door just enough to tell him I wasn't ready to talk, and he needed to leave. Rick's voice got louder, and he said I was turning his family against him and destroying his reputation over a misunderstanding. He kept saying misunderstanding like the lies he told were some kind of accident instead of deliberate choices he made over and over. Libby told him again to leave or she'd call the police, and after a few more minutes of him yelling through the door, I heard his footsteps going back down the hallway. Libby locked the door and came to sit next to me, and I realized I was shaking. The next day, Viviana texted asking if I'd meet her for coffee. I almost said no because I was exhausted from everything, but she seemed genuinely upset about what happened, so I agreed. We met at a coffee shop near Libby's apartment, and Viviana immediately apologized for believing Rick's version of events. She told me she'd always thought her mother was too hard on me, that some of Diane's comments seemed cruel, but Rick insisted it was just his mother's way of showing concern. Viviana said Rick had told her months ago that I was refusing fertility treatments because I was scared of the side effects, which was completely false. She kept apologizing and saying she should have asked me directly, instead of taking Rick's word for everything. I told her it wasn't her fault that Rick lied to everyone, but I appreciated her reaching out now. I sat with Viviana in that coffee shop for another hour, while she kept apologizing and explaining things I hadn't known. She told me Rick had called her back in March, months before the family dinner blow-up, saying I was being difficult about the fertility treatments. He told her I kept canceling appointments because I was scared of the side effects from the medication. That was completely false because I'd been taking every pill the doctor prescribed and going to every single appointment on time. Viviana said she believed Rick because he sounded so worried about me, like he was trying to protect me from my own fears. She admitted she should have asked me directly instead of just taking his word for everything. I told her it wasn't her fault that Rick lied, but part of me wondered how many other people he'd told similar stories to. Viviana pulled out her phone and showed me a text thread where Rick had sent her articles about women who refused fertility treatments due to anxiety. He'd been building this whole false story about me for months. I realized sitting there that Rick hadn't just lied about the test results. He'd been lying to everyone about everything, creating this whole false story where I was the difficult one holding us back from having kids. Viviana confirmed that Rick had told different family members different versions of events, always painting himself as the patient, suffering husband who was dealing with my problems. She said Aaron thought I was refusing to try IVF because I didn't want to gain more weight. Diane believed I was too focused on my career to prioritize fertility treatments. Rick had customized his lies to whatever would make each person feel most sympathetic toward him. I felt sick thinking about how carefully he'd planned all of this. 3 days later, Floyd called me while I was at work. He asked if I'd be willing to meet with him and Aaron without Rick or Diane present, saying they wanted to understand what really happened. His voice sounded tired and sad in a way I'd never heard before. I agreed to meet them because they seemed like the only ones actually interested in truth, instead of just protecting Rick. We met at a diner the following Saturday afternoon. Floyd and Aaron were already sitting in a booth when I arrived, and both of them stood up when they saw me come through the door. Floyd hugged me and said he was sorry for everything, and Aaron looked uncomfortable but sincere when he shook my hand. I slid into the booth across from them and pulled out a folder I'd prepared. Inside was a timeline I'd made of Rick's lies, starting with the day we got the test results, and going all the way through to the family dinner. I showed them the unopened medication boxes I'd photographed in Rick's car, the prescription dates proving he never took a single pill. I showed them screenshots of the texts from that woman Diane had introduced him to, the one who asked if he was really happy in his marriage. Floyd read through everything slowly, his jaw getting tighter with each page. When he got to the texts, he looked devastated as he realized his son had been actively considering leaving me while playing the martyr to everyone else. Aaron put his head in his hands and said he needed to tell me something. He admitted he knew Rick was talking to that woman more than he should have been. Rick had shown Aaron some of her texts months ago, laughing about how she was interested in him. Aaron said Rick told him it was just networking, that the woman worked in his industry and might have job connections. Aaron didn't want to cause drama in the family, so he stayed quiet about it. Floyd looked at his older son and told him he should have said something, that staying quiet made him part of the problem. Aaron agreed completely and said he failed me by not speaking up when he knew something was wrong. He apologized and said he'd convinced himself it wasn't his business to get involved in his brother's marriage. I told him I understood the instinct to avoid family drama, but yeah, it would have helped to know I wasn't crazy for being bothered by those texts. Floyd asked what I planned to do about the marriage. I told him honestly that I didn't know yet, but I couldn't stay with someone who destroyed my reputation to protect his ego. I couldn't be married to someone who let his mother treat me like garbage for a year, while he added more lies to make himself look better. Floyd nodded slowly and said he understood completely, that he wouldn't expect me to stay after what Rick had done. Then he surprised me by offering to pay for marriage counseling if I was willing to try that first. He said he knew Rick had serious problems, but maybe a professional could help him understand what he'd done wrong. I didn't commit to anything, but I took Floyd's number and said I'd think about it. The next week, I called a marriage counselor and made an appointment to meet with her alone first. I wanted to explain the situation before Rick could get in there and twist the story. The counselor's office was in a small building near downtown, and she had me fill out paperwork asking about the marriage and what brought me in. When we sat down in her office, I told her everything from the beginning. She listened without interrupting and took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she was quiet for a minute before she spoke. She told me honestly that couples therapy isn't recommended when there's been systematic lying and emotional abuse like what I'd described. She said bringing Rick into therapy right now would just give him a new place to manipulate me and control the story. She suggested individual therapy for me first to process the gaslighting I'd experienced and figure out what I actually wanted. She gave me names of 3 therapists who specialized in emotional abuse and manipulation. I left her office feeling relieved that someone with professional training had confirmed I wasn't overreacting. Rick found out I'd met with a counselor somehow, probably from checking our insurance statements online. He called me at work and accused me of trying to build a case against him instead of actually working on our marriage. He said real couples go to therapy together, that meeting with someone alone first was proof I'd already given up. His assumption that therapy was about building cases rather than healing told me everything I needed to know about how he saw our relationship. I told him I'd talk to him later and hung up before he could argue more. That evening, Libby came over to my apartment with takeout, and I told her about the counselor's recommendation. She pulled up her laptop and helped me research the 3 therapists. We read through their websites and reviews, looking for someone who seemed like a good fit. Libby found one named Dr. Mullen, who had great reviews and specialized in helping people recover from manipulative relationships. I called and made an appointment for the following Thursday. My first therapy session was overwhelming in ways I didn't expect. Dr. Mullen asked me to tell her about my marriage, and as I talked, she would stop me occasionally to point out things Rick had done that weren't normal or healthy. She helped me see patterns I'd missed because I was living through them. Like how Rick would apologize for small things to seem reasonable, but never apologized for the big things that actually mattered. Or how he'd agree to change something and then act like we'd never had that conversation. She asked about times before the fertility issues when Rick had lied or manipulated situations, and I realized there were dozens of examples I'd dismissed as misunderstandings or accidents. The session made me see how much of my reality Rick had distorted over the years beyond just the fertility issue. I left feeling exhausted, but also strangely lighter, like someone had finally given me permission to trust my own judgment again. 2 days after that first therapy session, I woke up to find a long email from Diane in my inbox. The subject line said, "A mother's plea," which should have been my first warning not to open it. She wrote that she'd been talking to her pastor about the situation, and they both agreed that marriage is sacred, and I needed to forgive Rick. She included several Bible verses about forgiveness and the importance of keeping families together. She wrote that Rick had made mistakes, but he was truly sorry and wanted to make things right. The email ended with her saying the real sin wasn't Rick's lies, but me causing division in the family by refusing to move past this. She said I was being selfish and prideful by holding on to anger instead of embracing Christian forgiveness. I read the whole thing twice, getting angrier each time. Diane had spent a year abusing me based on lies her son told her, and now she wanted to lecture me about sin and forgiveness. She'd organized prayer circles about my supposedly broken body and brought other women to family dinners to replace me, but somehow I was the one causing problems by not getting over it fast enough. I opened Diane's email one more time and hit reply. I typed a single sentence asking if her pastor knew she'd organized prayer circles about my private medical information without my consent, then hit send before I could second-guess myself. The email showed as delivered, but no response came back. Hours passed and my inbox stayed empty. I checked again before bed and still nothing. Diane always responded to everything immediately, usually with paragraphs of opinions and Bible verses, but this time she had nothing to say. The silence told me everything I needed to know about whether she actually thought her behavior was acceptable or just hoped I'd never challenge it. 3 days later, I got a Facebook message from someone named Emery who said he was Rick's friend from college. I didn't recognize the name, but I accepted the message because I was curious what he wanted. He wrote that he needed to tell me something that had been bothering him for months. He said Rick told him the truth about the fertility results back when we first got them, admitted over drinks that his sperm count was the main problem, but he couldn't tell his family. Emery wrote that he told Rick to come clean to everyone, but Rick said it was too late to change the story now, that his mother already believed it was my fault, and correcting her would make him look worse. Emery apologized for not reaching out sooner and said he felt terrible watching Rick lie to everyone while I took the blame. I sat staring at that message for a long time trying to process what it meant. Rick hadn't panicked and made a mistake in the moment like he'd been claiming. He'd deliberately told his friend the truth while continuing to lie to me and his entire family for months. He'd had conversations about his lies, made conscious choices to keep lying, even discussed strategy for maintaining the false story. This wasn't poor judgment or shame spiraling out of control. This was calculated deception where he knew exactly what he was doing and chose to keep doing it because protecting his image mattered more than protecting me. I thanked Emery for telling me and closed the app because I couldn't look at it anymore. That night, when Rick got home from work, I told him I wanted to separate, and I was going to start looking at apartments. His face went white, and he actually started crying, saying he'd do anything to fix this, and he couldn't lose me. I watched him cry and felt nothing except tired. I told him he could start by calling his mother right now, with me listening and telling her the complete truth about whose fertility problems were worse. He stopped crying and looked at me, then looked at his phone, then back at me. The hesitation lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it was enough. He asked if we could wait until tomorrow when his mother wasn't busy, said she'd take it better if he called at the right time. I told him his mother was never busy at 7 p.m. on a Thursday, and he knew it. He picked up his phone and put it down twice before finally admitting he wasn't ready yet, that he needed time to figure out how to explain it properly. I went to our bedroom and started looking up apartments on my laptop while Rick paced in the hallway asking me to please just give him one more day. I ignored him and bookmarked 3 places that looked affordable on my salary alone. Rick finally came in and sat on the bed next to me, took a deep breath and picked up his phone. He dialed his mother and put it on speaker so I could hear. Diane answered cheerfully asking what was wrong because Rick never called on weeknights. Rick stumbled through an explanation that he needed to correct something about the fertility results, that his issues were actually more severe than mine, that he'd lied because he was ashamed. The line went completely silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Diane asked in a strange, flat voice if this meant the prayer circle had been praying for the wrong person all along. Rick said yes and apologized. Diane said she needed to go and hung up without saying goodbye. Rick set his phone down and looked at me like he expected praise for finally doing the bare minimum of telling the truth. He said that was really hard for him and asked if I felt better now. I stared at him, not believing he actually thought he deserved credit for admitting he'd lied after getting caught. I told him I was still moving out, and he immediately switched from sad to angry, saying I'd never planned to forgive him anyway, and this whole thing was just me punishing him. He said he'd done what I asked and it still wasn't enough, that nothing would ever be enough for me. I closed my laptop and told him I was going to stay at Libby's again because I couldn't be in the same room with him right now. The next morning, Viviana texted asking if I wanted help looking at apartments, and I said yes. We met for coffee first, and she told me Aaron was furious with Rick for how he was handling everything. She said the family was splitting into camps. Some people thought I should forgive Rick for the sake of the marriage because everyone makes mistakes, but others thought Rick needed to face real consequences or he'd never actually change. Viviana said she was in the consequences camp, and so was Aaron. We spent the afternoon driving around looking at places I'd found online. Most of them were depressing or too expensive, but the last one was a small 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of an older building with hardwood floors and big windows. The landlord met us there and showed me around. It was tiny but clean, and the rent was something I could handle on my own salary without touching any joint accounts. I filled out the application right there, and the landlord called my employer to verify my job. He approved me on the spot, and I wrote a check for the deposit and first month's rent. Signing the lease felt terrifying and liberating at the same time, like I was finally taking control of my own life again instead of letting Rick control it for me. Viviana hugged me in the parking lot and said she was proud of me. I cried a little, but they were good tears, relief tears, the kind that come when you finally stop fighting against something you know is right. When I got back to Libby's apartment, I texted Rick that I'd found a place and signed a lease. My phone rang immediately, but I didn't answer. He called 4 more times, and I finally picked up. He was yelling before I even said hello, saying I couldn't just sign a lease without discussing it with him first, that he could contest it somehow, that I was abandoning our marriage vows. I waited for him to run out of steam, and then reminded him that he abandoned our marriage when he lied to everyone we know and let his mother abuse me for a year. He said that wasn't the same thing and I was being dramatic. I hung up and turned my phone off. My therapy appointment was the next day, and I told my therapist everything that had happened with the apartment and Rick's reaction. She pulled out a book and showed me a chapter about narcissistic personality patterns. She said Rick's behavior fit several of the traits, particularly the need to be seen as perfect, and the willingness to sacrifice anyone, including his spouse, to maintain that image. She explained that people with these traits often can't handle being wrong or flawed because their entire sense of self depends on being admired. She said Rick probably wasn't going to suddenly become the person I thought I married, because that person never actually existed. It was just a performance Rick put on when it suited his needs. Understanding that helped something click into place in my brain. I could stop hoping he'd wake up and fix himself because he didn't think anything about himself needed fixing. The problem in his mind would always be everyone else's reaction to his behavior, never the behavior itself. I picked a Tuesday morning when Rick had back-to-back meetings at work that would keep him out until at least 3. Libby showed up at 9 with her SUV, and Viviana arrived 10 minutes later in Aaron's truck. We didn't waste time talking about what we were doing or why. We just started loading boxes. I'd already packed most of my clothes and personal items the night before, working quietly in the guest room while Rick watched television in the living room pretending everything was normal. Viviana took the boxes from my closet while Libby helped me wrap the few pieces of furniture that were actually mine, things I'd brought into the marriage or bought with my own money before we combined finances. The kitchen was harder because I had to decide what felt like mine versus what felt like ours, and I ended up leaving most of it because cooking together had been one of Rick's favorite ways to play happy couple for his family. I took my grandmother's mixing bowls and the cast iron skillet my dad gave me and left everything else. The living room was where I struggled most because we decorated it together during our first year of marriage when I still believed we were building something real. Every piece of furniture held a memory of us picking it out, discussing colors, imagining the life we'd have in this space. I walked away from all of it. Viviana found me standing in front of the bookshelf trying to decide which books were mine and which were Rick's, and she just started pulling down anything that looked worn or highlighted. She said those were clearly mine because Rick never actually read the books he bought. He just displayed them to look smart. We loaded box after box into the vehicles, and the house started looking emptier, like the life Rick had constructed was disappearing piece by piece. I left behind the wedding photos, the vacation pictures Diane had framed for us, the decorative items his mother kept buying to make our house look more proper. By noon, the SUV and truck were both packed and the house looked hollow. I walked through each room one last time and felt nothing except relief that I was leaving. I locked the door behind me and put my key in an envelope with a note that said, I'd be back for anything I forgot once we worked out a schedule. Libby drove me to my new apartment and we spent the afternoon unloading boxes and arranging furniture. The apartment was tiny compared to the house, but it felt more like home than anywhere I'd lived with Rick. Viviana ordered pizza and we ate sitting on my new couch, the only piece of furniture I'd bought just for myself. She told me Aaron was proud of me for leaving, and that he'd been wanting to confront Rick about his behavior for months, but didn't know how without making things worse for me. Around 5, my phone started buzzing with texts from Rick asking where I was and why I wasn't answering. I ignored them and kept unpacking boxes with Libby and Viviana. At 6, Rick called and I let it go to voicemail. He called 3 more times before I finally answered just to stop the constant buzzing. He was screaming before I even said hello, demanding to know where I was and why half the house was empty. I told him I'd moved out and taken only what was mine like I'd said I would. He yelled that I couldn't just leave without discussing it more, that we needed to talk about this like adults, that I was being crazy and dramatic. I reminded him we'd discussed it plenty over the past 2 weeks, and I was done being married to someone who cared more about his image than his wife. He started crying and saying I was abandoning him when he needed me most, that his whole family was turning against him because of what I did. I told him his family was turning against him because of what he did, not me, and hung up. Libby hugged me and said she was staying the night because she didn't trust Rick not to show up at my door. The next morning, Floyd called while I was making coffee in my new kitchen. He asked how I was settling in and if I needed anything, then mentioned that Diane had been crying to everyone who would listen about how I destroyed her family. I could hear the frustration in his voice as he described her calling relatives and church friends, painting herself as the victim of my cruelty. Floyd said he'd finally had enough and told her firmly that Rick destroyed his own marriage and she helped by being cruel to me based on lies she never questioned. He said Diane tried to argue that she was just being a concerned mother, but he shut that down by asking why she never once thought to verify Rick's story with me directly. Floyd apologized again for not stepping in sooner and said he should have recognized the signs that something was wrong with how Diane was treating me. I thanked him for finally standing up to her and told him it meant a lot that he was willing to see the truth, even though Rick was his son. He said being his son didn't excuse Rick's behavior, and that he hoped I'd still consider him family, even after the divorce was final. That conversation gave me the push I needed to make my next call. Jerome Tyler's office was in a downtown building with glass walls and modern furniture that made me feel like I was taking this seriously. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with wire-rimmed glasses and a calm way of speaking that made me feel less panicked about everything. I showed him the medical records, the texts from Rick to the woman Diane introduced him to, screenshots of Diane's prayer circle videos, and my own documentation of every cruel comment and lie over the past year. Jerome reviewed everything carefully and said I had strong grounds for divorce based on emotional abuse and fraud. He explained that Rick's lies about fertility had created both financial damages from unnecessary treatments I'd undergone and emotional damages from the abuse I'd suffered as a result of those lies. He said most divorce cases didn't have this level of documentation, and that Rick's pattern of deception would not look good to a judge if we ended up in court. Jerome asked if I thought Rick would contest the divorce, and I said probably because he couldn't stand losing control of the narrative. He nodded like he'd expected that answer and said we should prepare for Rick to make this difficult, but that the evidence was overwhelmingly in my favor. I signed the paperwork to retain him as my attorney, and he said he'd have divorce papers drawn up and served to Rick within a week. Walking out of his office, I felt like I'd finally taken real action instead of just reacting to Rick's choices. Rick received the divorce papers at work on a Thursday afternoon. I know because he showed up at my apartment 20 minutes after the process server left his office. He pounded on my door so hard my neighbor came out to see what was happening. I told Rick through the door that I wasn't letting him in and he needed to leave. He started begging, saying he'd made mistakes, but he'd go to therapy and fix everything if I just gave him another chance. His voice broke and he cried that he couldn't lose me, that he'd do anything to make this right. I stood on the other side of the door listening to him make promises I'd heard before and felt nothing except tired. I told him I wasn't interested in watching him perform change to avoid consequences. He got angry then and started yelling that I was being vindictive, that I wanted to punish him instead of save our marriage. I said our marriage couldn't be saved because it was never real to begin with. It was just a stage for him to play the devoted husband while treating me like garbage. He kicked my door hard enough to rattle the frame and my neighbor threatened to call the police. Rick finally left, but I could hear him crying in the hallway as he walked away. Diane called 2 days later and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She was crying before she even said hello, telling me she was sorry for how she treated me and that she should have questioned Rick's story from the beginning. She admitted she was horrible to me and said she'd been praying for forgiveness for her cruelty. I listened without saying anything while she listed all the ways she'd been wrong, and it sounded genuine for the first time since this whole thing started. Then she asked if there was any way I could forgive Rick and give him another chance, saying he was devastated and barely functioning. I told her that wasn't my responsibility anymore. She cried harder and said she understood but couldn't. I see that Rick had learned his lesson and would never lie again. I said people don't learn lessons without facing consequences, and Rick had spent his whole life avoiding those. Diane was quiet for a long moment, and then asked what she could do to help fix this. I told her she could start by admitting to her prayer circle that she'd been praying over false information and apologizing to everyone she'd told about my supposed fertility problems. She promised she would, and I hung up not entirely believing her, but hoping maybe she'd actually follow through. Rick tried everything to drag out the divorce proceedings. He contested the division of assets, claimed I'd hidden money, demanded spousal support even though we had similar incomes. Jerome warned him through his lawyer that if we went to trial, all of Rick's lies and manipulation would become public record in court documents that anyone could access. He explained that Rick's medical records, the evidence of his deception and testimony from family members about his behavior, would all be entered as evidence. Rick's lawyer clearly wasn't happy about any of this because she kept trying to push Rick toward a settlement. After 3 months of back and forth, Jerome sent Rick's lawyer a detailed outline of exactly what would be presented in court, including witness lists that had Viviana, Aaron, and Floyd ready to testify about Rick's lies. Rick finally agreed to a fair settlement to avoid that embarrassment. His lawyer called Jerome and they worked out terms over the phone while I sat in Jerome's office feeling surreal that my marriage was ending through lawyer negotiations. The divorce mediation happened in a conference room with beige walls and uncomfortable chairs. Rick showed up looking exhausted and refused to make eye contact with me. His lawyer was a woman in her 50s who kept shooting Rick frustrated looks every time he tried to argue about something petty. We went through the asset division item by item, and Rick tried to claim things that were clearly mine, like my grandmother's jewelry and my car that I'd owned before we got married. His lawyer would quietly tell him to let it go, and he'd sulk but back down. We agreed on a clean split of assets with no alimony since we'd only been married 3 years and both had similar incomes. Rick signed the papers with shaking hands, and his lawyer looked relieved it was finally over. The mediator said the divorce would be final once a judge reviewed and approved everything, which would take about 30 days. I walked out of that conference room and drove straight to Libby's apartment where she had wine and takeout waiting. Viviana texted me a week later saying Rick had started telling people I left him because I didn't want kids after all. He was creating a whole new false narrative where I'd been the one lying about wanting children, and he was heartbroken that I'd wasted years of his life. She said several relatives had heard this version, and some were actually believing it. I felt my stomach drop because of course Rick couldn't just accept responsibility. He had to create another lie to protect himself. Floyd found out about Rick's new story and called a family meeting without Rick or Diane present. Viviana told me later that Floyd laid out the entire truth to the extended family, showing them copies of the medical records and explaining exactly what Rick had done. Several relatives reached out to me afterward apologizing for believing Rick's lies, both the old ones and the new ones. One of Rick's aunts sent me a long email saying she'd always thought something was off about how Diane treated me, but she'd trusted Rick's version of events. She said she felt terrible for not questioning it sooner and hoped I could forgive her for being part of the problem. 4 months after that family dinner where I read the medical records out loud, my divorce was finalized. Jerome called to tell me the judge had signed off on everything and it was officially over. I hung up the phone and sat in my apartment feeling relief more than sadness. I wasn't grieving the marriage that actually existed, the one where my husband lied to everyone and let his mother torture me. I was grieving the marriage I thought I had, the partnership I believed we were building before I knew it was all performance. That version of my marriage had never been real, but I'd loved it anyway, and letting go of that illusion hurt, even though I knew it had to happen. Libby came over that night with champagne and we toasted to new beginnings. Viviana stopped by with Aaron and we all sat around my tiny living room talking about anything except Rick. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without wondering what lie was being told about me or what cruelty was coming next. I kept going to therapy every week, and my therapist helped me see patterns I'd missed before. Rick used to tell me I was too sensitive when I got upset about things he did, and I believed him because he said it so calmly, like it was just a fact. My therapist showed me that was manipulation, making me doubt my own feelings so I'd accept his behavior. She pointed out how Rick would promise to change and then do the exact same thing again, always with a good excuse ready. I started keeping a list of red flags to watch for in future relationships. Things like someone who needs to be the hero in every story they tell, or who blames everyone else when things go wrong, or who gets angry when you set boundaries. Writing it all down made me realize how many warning signs I'd ignored with Rick, because I wanted to believe he was who he pretended to be. 6 months after I moved out, I was buying groceries when I saw Emery in the produce section. He looked uncomfortable when he spotted me, but came over anyway. He asked how I was doing and I said I was good, which true for once. Then he got quiet and said he thought I should know that Rick was dating someone new. My stomach dropped, but I kept my face neutral. Emery said Rick was already talking about wanting kids with her, telling her how important family was to him. I felt sorry for this woman I'd never met because she had no idea what she was getting into. Emery asked if I thought he should warn her, and I told him no, that it wasn't our place and she probably wouldn't believe us anyway. People have to figure out who Rick really is on their own, just like I did. I finished my shopping and left, feeling grateful I wasn't that woman anymore. Libby decided to throw me a divorce party even though I told her it was silly. She invited everyone to her apartment and called it a celebration of me standing up for myself. Viviana showed up with Aaron and they both hugged me when they walked in. Viviana brought wine and Aaron brought fancy cheese and we all sat around eating snacks and talking about anything except Rick. At one point, Viviana raised her glass and said she was proud to call me her sister, and Aaron agreed. I realized I'd lost a husband but gained real family. People who actually cared about me instead of just what I could do for them. Libby made a joke about burning my wedding photos, and I laughed because I'd already thrown them away weeks ago. We stayed up late playing card games, and I felt lighter than I had in years, surrounded by people who saw me as a person instead of a problem to fix. Now I'm building a life that's actually mine instead of one based on Rick's lies. My apartment is small, but it's decorated the way I like it, not the way Rick's mother thought was proper. I go to therapy and work and see my friends without worrying what story Rick is telling people about me. I'm even thinking about dating again eventually, though I'm not in a rush. The difference is that now I know exactly what I won't accept from a partner. I trust myself to recognize the warning signs and walk away when something feels wrong, instead of making excuses and hoping things will get better. I'm genuinely happy for the first time in years, not performing happiness to make someone else comfortable. My life is quiet and simple and completely honest, and that's worth more than any version of happiness I had to pretend to feel.